On behalf of the trustees and the staff, I would like to welcome you to this event, the House of Seven Gables, and a presentation entitled The Gables and Climate Change, What's Next? Thank you for being here. My name is Steve Immerman, and I am a board member here at the House of Seven Gables, where we preserve, share, and continue the American story. For those of you who are new to the Gables, and I don't think there's probably anybody in the room that might be, but nonetheless, we pursue that vision through public programs, our citizenship and ESL classes, the preservation and interpretation of this special place, and of course, the history and relevance of Nathaniel Hawthorne, his life and his work, especially as it relates to our culture today. For more information, I encourage you to browse the website of the House of Seven Gables, become a member, attend events, and certainly if you have the opportunity this evening, go out and take a peek at the gardens, because they're lovely this time of year. And you can see where a wonderful wedding is going to be tomorrow out on the lawn. So if you need to rent, let us know. This presentation is the result of 2 years worth of data gathering, study, and problem solving with some of the top experts in the region. We are enormously grateful to Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management for the grant that made this work possible. Gables, as an organization that values community and storytelling, and as the first cultural institution in the state to receive a grant like this, we're committed to talking about our work while we're doing it. We strive to be open, transparent, and hopefully helpful, and maybe even a model for other organizations and individuals as they tackle their own climate change challenges. So like many, we started out with this work on the assumption that it was all about keeping the water out, building our seawall higher, becoming more of a campus that was impenetrable. And we quickly realized that the reality was that we had to manage our relationship with the water through a broad range of adaptations and interventions designed to minimize flooding and to create adaptations during storm surge events. The flood models for the next 50 years can be frightening. And some of the steps we've considered may seem dramatic. But it's important to remember that we represent only one entity, one property taking action, kind of like in a vacuum. But if we band together as a community and work on community-wide solutions to this inevitable impact of climate change, we can have a much greater impact. So at this time, I'd like to turn over the program to Paul Wright, who is driving much of this agenda. He is the Director of Preservation and Maintenance at the Gables, and he'll give you an overview of what you're going to hear tonight and how it's going to lay out. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for setting the tone really well for this really important discussion. So my name is Paul Wright, as Steve mentioned. I'm Director of Preservation and Maintenance here at the House of Seven Gables. I've served as the project manager, sort of the Gables owner project manager for this project. But this presentation is going to be coming from a few of us because this is just such a big topic that having one person tackle it really requires a team. And I've been really fortunate to have such an excellent team help with this very important project. So we're going to kick things off with Susan Baker, our collections manager. She's going to be talking about how this project started, what the genesis of the project was, what she was seeing. And then we'll hand things over to Barbara Warren, Salem Sound Coast Watch. She's going to share with us the climate science, the data that we've been collecting, and some of the data that's become available about our region, and how we're going to respond to that. Then I'll jump up here and talk about the process that we've been working on. And the 2-year process has not been an easy one. There's been a lot of back and forth, about deliberation about how we're going to move forward. And then finally, I'll be handing things over to Kara Babcock from Union Studios, who has been our architectural consultants for this project, and they helped envision sort of a master plan for the final phase of this project, which has been really helpful and keen in bringing things together. So with that said, I'm going to hand things over to Susan Baker right now.
Hi everyone, I am going to just do a really quick kind of introduction and talk about why we undertook this project and kind of how it started. So, what was going on at the Gables? We were starting to really experience the effects of climate change on our campus. This is a picture that shows just kind of, this wasn't even a full, this was a picture of a storm. This isn't even full tide, and this just shows you, this is our walkway here by our seawall down on the lawn. It just shows you kind of the wave action that we are experiencing at high tides and during storms. And then this is an interesting picture. Some of you may have already seen this, but this is where a sinkhole formed and one of our guests fell up to like her knees in a hole there that we really didn't know was a problem before that happened. So luckily the guest was okay, didn't sue us, which is great. But we realized we had a real issue with our seawall, and that was one of the things that was kind of percolating around when this project started to be talked about. Our seawall was not in great shape and was not really adequate anymore, we thought, for protecting the site. I'm going to show you a little.
You got to click.
Oh, there it goes. So this red building here is the print house owned by us. It's at the end of Turner Street. We use it to store maintenance equipment, and you'll see in a second kind of the kinds of things that we're dealing with right now on the Gables property. That's the building being inundated during a storm, and that's kind of typical of kind of some of the things we're starting to see on the property. Okay, so in addition to kind of storm surge and issues we have with rising tides and wave action, we also are experiencing increased rainfalls. We all know that. We have, significantly larger and longer rainfall events these days. And these are just pictures of some of the flooding that we're starting to experience. So when I first came here 8 years ago, none of the basements really flooded. And then since I've been here, the basements have started flooding regularly, not just from, like windows, but from seepage into the foundations. So this just shows rainfall accumulation and some of the issues we're having with the buildings because of so much kind of dampness and rain, as well as basement flooding. The problem with basement flooding is that also affects the structures of the buildings and also, from my perspective, the collections in the buildings. And that's how I got involved in this. Here's another video. So this is looking at the basement door of our preservation maintenance workshop, which is in the Hooper Hathaway building, one of our buildings on campus. And you can see that the rain is just filling up the well, and then is coming over under the door and into the room where all this mechanical machinery is. So we have a lot of storm water issues as well. I'm the collection manager here. I take care of the collections and the curatorial issues of the Gables. So why am I up here talking to you about this? Well, one of the things we had a big storm. The basement of the birthplace, the Nathaniel Hawthorne's birthplace, flooded, and we had a massive kind of 3-week, very high humidity after that. And the whole building became infested with mold and spread to a lot of our collections pieces. And these are pieces of furniture owned by the Nathaniel Hawthorne's family. These are books that have mold on them. And the high humidity is really starting to impact the collections. High humidity in collections should be between 40 and 60% maximum to control kind of infestations of mold. And this shows you an 84% reading. And it's even at a low temperature. So low temperatures tend to keep humidity down, but in this case, it really doesn't because we have porous old buildings. And even though we have HVAC in these buildings, it just can't keep up with humidity levels that we're experiencing now. So all these things were happening. Paul was not here at the time, and I became really concerned about climate change at the Gables and how it was impacting our campus. So at the same time, I was the Gables representative at on Preservation Partners, which is a city-owned, city-run organization of preservation groups in the city. We meet regularly and talk about our issues. And it became kind of clear during that some of us in that group were particularly concerned about climate change and the impact of climate change on our properties, including the Gables, but also PPSX and the National Park Service and a number of others. And in that group, I met Barbara Warren, who is the executive director of Salem Sound Coast Watch, who will be talking to you soon about what's going on in Salem in terms of climate change. But Barbara and I talked a lot about, how are we going to adapt? We didn't want to just be reactive, and something terrible happens, and then we start, trying to plan for what we're going to do. We really wanted to plan in advance, understanding that this was going to be kind of a really significant problem for the Gables. So Barbara mentioned, coastal zone management. She works with a lot of municipalities that get grants from coastal zone management. That's a science-based grant program, something that a museum would normally never really have anything to do with. But we started talking to coastal zone management, and they encouraged us to apply for this grant, which we did, and we got the grant for $500,000 to do a 2-year project to assess the site and to come up with an adaptation plan. So that's my piece of this, and then
You want to mention the coming up?
oh yes, I'm sorry, I should mention. So that group also runs an annual conference called Preservation in a Changing Climate. We have some really great speakers and panels talking about adaptations and mitigation strategies. We have an upcoming one on September 18th. It takes place, it's a day-long event. It takes place at the PPSX Museum. We're about to finalize, we pretty much finalized our agenda, and that will be released soon. So I urge you to check the PEMS website and also preservingsalem.com website. We have some incredible speakers this year that we're really digging down deeper into some of these. The Gables will be talking more about the adaptation plan at that stage as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce Barbara Warren. She'll take it.
So I think you've seen all the logos of the people who are on the team, and you'll hear about them more tonight. So Coastal Zone Management, Salem Sound Coast Watch, Collins Engineers, that's for the seawall. Horsley Witten Group did the environmental assessments. I'll talk about that in my presentation, and then Kara is doing from Union Studios. Okay. So my piece is to talk to you about climate, and I could talk for hours about that. I'm going to be very brief, and I think you probably are everyone who's in the room knows what's happening with climate change. I'm not going to go so much into the science, but more how is it going to affect Massachusetts, how is it going to affect Salem. But we see that we're concerned about sea level rise, we're concerned about storm surge that gets worse with sea level rise, and then more rain. These are all the things that Susan has been showing that the Gables is already impacted by. And then there's also heat. And we're not going to really talk about heat except for Susan already talked about it because it's the humidity. So you've got the heat and the humidity. And these are all future conditions, but we're seeing them now. So Coastal Zone Management, I wanted to share this with you because it's a state agency. Julia Neisel lives in our community in the Derby Street neighborhood, and she is the coastal shoreline and floodplain manager for Coastal Zone Management, and she runs the Storm Smart Coast program. And so you're going to see some maps tonight, but you can go to this the state's webpage, and each one of these, this is sea level rise. It's a map that you can get from NOAA that's sort of static, what they predict for sea level. This one is hurricane surge, what hurricane category 1 through 4. This is FEMA. I'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about this tonight. So what you see, you can go plug that in and you can see it for Gloucester, you can see it for Salem, you can see it for Boston, all these maps. And basically just do Massachusetts sea level rise or coastal flooding viewer, and it'd be easy to come up with. So what the state did, Massachusetts has been very active in climate, and what they did is it started out with the Mass Department of Transportation and the tunnels down in Boston, and they were concerned about them flooding. So they hired the Woods Hole Group, and they started making these for the maps. Then the state basically downscaled all the global averages, because generally what you hear is they say, well, we're going to have, 6 inches of sea level rise globally. But the Northeast, where we live, is a hot spot, and we're going to have more sea level rise than other places. It's going to be different. And so they looked at sea level, which you see in these graphs. We've got the chart and the graph, they say the same thing. So different scenarios. The worst is the dark blue, then it goes down to the best case scenario. But you can see that the sea level rise is going to increase. And we don't know exactly when, but we know it is increasing and it will increase. And even if we were able to stop all our CO2 emissions, sea levels will continue because we've heated up so much of the atmosphere, the glaciers, Greenland and Antarctica. But so they made these, and again, you can go to resilientma.mass, and there's lots of reports. So they've really been giving the communities data to use for studies like today, the one you're going to see today. The FEMA maps have been out there a long time. What I wanted to show here is, this is the Prim House, and this is the end of Hardy Street, and the counting house is in here. And this is all a VE zone. That means a velocity zone. So there's a 1% chance of being impacted by waves when there's a storm. And you saw that with the Prim House. That's the one that's getting impacted the most right now. AE zone means that you're likely to get flooded because of your elevation and your proximity to a source, which is Salem Harbor right here. Oops. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. Storm surge. What is storm surge? We've all seen it, whether we know it or not. So if we look at this diagram here, back in the 1880s, there was the ocean came up to here when it was flooding. It's called the floodplain. So rivers have a floodplain. The coast has a floodplain. And then the storm pushes up the waves. Now, so the house was built and everybody thought they were safe. But now we are at a higher sea level, and now the waves are going to go in further. And it's just going to keep happening. And this is what we have to be concerned about. And in January 2018, that was a real wake-up call for Massachusetts, especially the North Shore. We had a 4-foot storm surge on top of an 11-foot tide. So our tides are usually 9 feet, sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher, but average 9. And we're getting more and more 11-foot tides. So we got 11-foot tide plus winds that blew the storm up to made it, what you see here, oh, I keep going backwards, sorry. Move my finger, there you go. So this is, of course, you know this, there's a delay, and so I don't see the recording. This is the Derby Wharf. You can see the lighthouse way out there, that white speck. Where you see this line, that's the edge of the beach. Of course, this is the yard. This is the other wharf. Here's Central Wharf, completely underwater. This was taken from the cupola by the National Park. Thank you, Gavin. And this was I talked about the Grayson storm in January in 2018, and then March we had 2 more storms, and again, almost as high. And so, you'll see what this, everybody was pretty shocked by this. So the other thing, a warming climate equals a change in frequency and duration and magnitude of extreme weather events. And that's what we're seeing. So I just looked back at My Coast. My Coast is on the CZM website, Storm Smart, and they collect photos. So you can take a picture during a storm and send it to them, and it's recorded the location. You can explain whether there's any damage. And you can also go back and look at that. So I went through it, and this is just one I pulled out. There are so many. But I went back, 2023, we had a storm that was recorded in January, March, September, and December. And then in 2024, remember January 13th? That's this one. This is the corner of Webb Street and Satella Lane and Essex, where the light is. And you can see this is Collins Cove over here, the propeller. And the road has been closed. And this was just one of the roads that was closed during that time. So this year, so far, we've had January 13th, February 13th, March 10th, and April 4th. So what's happening here? It's a warming climate. So back in, it was either 2018 or 2020, worked with the National Park with Gavin, who's here, and we got the Woods Hole group, who made these maps for the state, but they weren't available yet. We got them to give a presentation, and it's on the Salem Sound website. So all these, there's a lot of background that you can get if you go to salemsound.org and look at the climate resilience, the climate adaptation. So I'm going to show you these maps. This is present day, and this is a probability of being flooded. Of course, the harbor's always flooded, so it's black, and that's 100%. 1% is, let's go here, 1% is this light green. That's a 100-year storm. You have a 1% chance of being flooded during the year. And so what I want you to do is just pick out an area on the map, because I'm going to go through the present, 2030, 2050, and 2070. So, this is Palmer Cove. This is where we are, right in here. This is Collins Cove. This is the Willows. This is the North River. This is Salem State. So just on your eye, just pick one of them, and we'll see. Okay, this is 2030. Now here, it doesn't mean that it's going to be flooded underwater all the time. It's just during the storm. Okay, and that is if we don't do anything, given where the elevation is now. 2050, you see it expanding. Down here, Salem State, and 2070. So the frequency of flooding increases, and as it increases, also the area increases. So these are all on our website, and they're also available online. So now the study looked at, Horsley Witten pulled this together for the team, and this is present day, and this is, again, the 1% chance a year, but we know sometimes you can have it 4 times a year. So it's just probability, and it used to be referred to the 100-year storm, but that's really misleading, because people said, oh, I had my 100-year storm, I'm fine for 100 years. It doesn't work that way. So again, this red is the 1%, and so less, you know, I think that's backwards. Let's keep going. So now this is 2030, and you can see how there's more chance, greater chance of it moving inland and becoming more frequent. And did it move? Yeah, 2050. You see that red moving around the property. And now 2070. It's sort of the, I'm going to use a SH hits the fan. You know, that's sort of, by 2070, that's what it feels like in a lot of cases. Well, these are all about coastal storms and winds and coming at high tide, and then the tide goes down so there's less flooding. But Susan also pointed out that we have rain events. And so with climate change, there is what we call atmospheric wetting. Every 1 degree C or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, the air can hold 7% more water. And we're already almost at 2 degrees C. So we're over 10% more water in the atmosphere. So we have had rain events where it just, heavens open up and we get 6 inches of rain in an hour or two. And that's part of the climate change. So we get more chaotic weather. We get heat. This one is the drought map, and we can go from a very wet winter to a drought during the summer. New England, the East Coast, is going to get 71% more frequent extreme precipitation events compared to the rest of them, and you can see the rest of the United States. So rain is a serious problem as well. So to deal with this, to understand it here at the Gables, Horsley Witten put in 4 wells, one up in the parking lot near Derby Street, one over here, one closer to Turner and the Prim House, and then one in the yard, in the garden by the seawall. And they have been monitoring that as well as a tide gauge out at Hawthorne Marina. And so we've got information about the depth to groundwater, compared to the tides, compared to rain events, and they looked at the drainage infrastructure, and we're going to learn more about that. So you've probably heard stories of the Cape where it's so sandy that the seawater is coming up. So we needed to know how far is the ocean coming up and how is it affecting those basements. Is it all fresh water coming from the gutters, or is it coming up from the ground? Should I click in there? I don't know why. Clicker doesn't seem to want to work for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I'm going to pick it up from here and get into a little bit more about the process. We were basically presented with some of these findings and basically kind of trying to come to what is the conclusion of what is our next step. Now, I put this here first. This is basically a diagram that's part of the Secretary of the Interior standards. So that's basically, we are a National Historic Landmark. So we are beholden to preserve this site to the highest standards of preservation that we possibly can. So we have taken their standards and they actually have a flood adaptation guidelines that we used as sort of a guide as well. But sort of taking that and balancing sort of how can we adapt to these flood projections while maintaining our historic character, and then also finding things that are feasible for us to do, because it's a lot to say one thing, it's another thing to do it. Let's see. That is real low, so to start things off, we did have a couple of meetings that we got brought together, checkpoints I would call them. We call them charrettes, but basically we had a year 1 check-in and a year 2 check-in. And these were designed for us to come in and collect the data and talk about some of the the biggest issues that we were grappling with at the time. And so the first year it kind of checked in, we were talking about collecting the data, identifying threats and solutions. We also invited some people in, so National Park Service in the city, we wanted to see, were you seeing the same thing? What's going on around the city? What are you guys doing about these things? And then we also started the idea of creating the process of a timeline with triggers for action. So that's basically when this starts happening, we'll start doing this. And then year 2, our process is basically just sort of a rechecking in with that data, reassessing and solidifying those plans, and then that's also when we began to develop sort of this overarching master plan for the campus. So there's a nice little picture of us in the meeting, but this is sort of the beginning development of the timeline, which you'll see a little bit more in depth as it develops as we go. So I just am touching on, again, something Barbara already mentioned, but we did have to collect data throughout the process, really. So we had a lot of the maps and everything that was available, made available to us. We also did really detailed site surveys, getting basically elevations across the entire site that allowed those maps and the information that they gave to be really site-specific for us. And then, as you mentioned, the monitoring wells, which were really crucial. And we actually got updated information from them just yesterday or today that we've sort of added into some of our evaluations. So we have been identifying these main threats, and again, this is kind of highlighting some of the things that Barbara's already mentioned. So we have sea level rise. This is our site here. Sea level rise is going to affect the edges of our property. It's not the regular everyday high tide that's going to be coming in and inundating us, though. It is, as we've already mentioned, that storm surge, which is going to be coming in further, and it's also going to be coming in deeper as time goes on. So this is another chart kind of showing the same thing that the earlier map that Barbara showed, except that this imagery is meant to show there's a gradient for depth. So you can see that as it goes in, it's also getting deeper. You can also kind of tell the direction that the water is coming from. Basically coming in from the other side. We have a marina on the other side of us there. So this is actually an important point to sort of note that, Steve had already mentioned it. Hardening our edge was the initial assessment that we thought we would take, raising the seawall to block that in. But sort of as we see these maps, it became more clear that raising the seawall is not going to be the thing that does it, because we have too many properties to our sides that, either haven't raised their seawall yet or don't have basically a substantial enough one. City properties, private properties that are all contributing to that. There's a possibility for communal action, but we have to act before that ends up happening. So then we had collected information about that groundwater and precipitation and how it's affecting the site. So we had our elevations, our subsurface map also showing basically which way water is flowing. Is it heading towards drains? Are we capturing it properly or not? We kind of have in this area basically a giant bowl amongst all these buildings here. So we know that there's problems over there that we need to capture that water and direct it away from buildings. And then we have here, this is a cross section of our entire campus. So this is Derby Street here, and this is the water. And then what we have is the locations of the boring wells telling us where the groundwater level is sort of on average. So we have a present day observed high groundwater. And you can see it's actually already being noted in, this is actually the basement space right below us. Fortunately, this basement was built in 1993. Some say they don't build them like they used to. One thing that we're really glad that they do build them different now is that they actually put waterproofing on the outside of the foundations. So this basement is relatively dry. We do see some humidity. We're trying to monitor and evaluate that, but this is much more stable compared to the other ones. But what we're seeing is already, of course, we're seeing it after storms, but even what's going to happen is that in 2030 and 2050, the average water height is going to be above basement level, the bottom of the foundation. So it's going to be seeing that even in a relatively dry period, we're going to be seeing groundwater impacting our foundations, coming through, even just wicking through and adding to the humidity. So we started identifying what are our solutions to all these issues. And so we kind of touched a little bit on them. Some of them are real low-hanging fruit. Improving our gutters. We have a set of historic gutters throughout our site that are colonial revival, so they're not really designed necessarily to capture water more efficiently. They're designed to look nice on our buildings. So how do we improve those without, harming that historic fabric? We took a little trial at this already, and we basically put a little scoop on there to grab some water. That's our first trial. We're kind of looking at other options as well. And then rain barrels on buildings. I kind of typed this picture behind here. We want to capture water. We want to capture the water, slow it down. And so, rain barrels is a low-hanging fruit way of taking care of that. But as things move on, we are going to be wanting taking much more effective measures throughout the site. So we identified, some of the problem areas, sort of the bowl in our garden, behind some of our other buildings, next to Uber Hathaway, where that video you saw with the water filling up. And then also, so whenever you can reduce runoff, that is a great thing that can be done. So we, talked about permeable pavers. All the pavement throughout the city is contributing to running water off into the ocean faster. That contributes to flooding. It also sends it towards buildings and other places that you don't want it. But the more that you can let the soil absorb the water, that slows that rate of runoff heading to the ocean and contributing to flooding. So permeable pavers, subsurface storage, we have some smaller dry wells that we've added into the plan. And then rain gardens, which are basically natural absorption in areas. So basically using plants and soil that can basically naturally absorb excess water. So storm surge adaptations that we had to look at. Of course, I already mentioned about sea walls. That's sort of, again, everyone's going to thinking the first thing you do is raising the seawall. Even if we're not able to raise the seawall, though, and defend things, we still need to maintain it. So that's something that we've already started on our process. We took care of that actually last summer, and we did a little bit more this summer. But we know we need to do more, so even if we're not raising it, we need to be shoring it up. It is a dry stack stone wall, so we want to put a concrete stem wall behind that, and then also add a drainage, because the more storms are overtopping, there's going to be more water kind of rushing back and putting back pressure on it, so we need strength, concrete to keep that from pushing it over, plus intentional drainage to allow the water to flow out in a controlled manner. And the other idea is that doing the strengthening will mean that if we do come to sort of a community consensus and plan of how to raise seawalls, we're going to be ready to do that. We will be able to build on top of this. All right, so other adaptation solutions, we considered some temporary solutions, floodgates, sandbags, building rafts, and dams. This is something that we actually need to start getting move on now, because several of our buildings are basically ready to do that. And so we're ready to be flooded by the next storm surge. If we get a category 2 or 3 hurricane coming up here, we're looking into some trouble. So we've got to start getting on that. But then the sort of the more invasive ones, again, considered, not necessarily planned for all of them, but all the things that we looked at include basically some pumps. That one's actually pretty much basic, ready to go. But also wet floodproofing versus dry floodproofing, 2 different ways of dealing with water coming into your basement that were considered throughout the campus. And then getting into the even more, we have basic, I jumped ahead, because that's not wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing. This is moving stuff out of the basement and getting them to the second floor, because that's pretty obvious. If you have a bunch of important HVAC equipment in the basement, you don't want it to flood. And then relocating your exterior utilities as well. We have a lot of condensers on the outside of our buildings that need to be dealt with, that are vulnerable and on the ocean side of the property. And that gives us an opportunity to think about mitigation as well. So that means, energy efficiency. If we're going to change our systems, we should move towards heat pumps, electric systems that are going to not contribute to climate change. All right. So then, as I mentioned, wet floodproofing. which is basically trying to make your basements more impermeable. It's a difficult task because some of our basements are basically dry laid stone or mortared stone that's not meant to be waterproof. And then also wet flood proofing, which is basically where you allow the water to come in and then you let it flow out and you dry it out. So it's about controlling the water, letting it come through. And then even more intensive is elevating the structure and building relocation, which is, of course, so we get into, the Secretary of Interior standards, that they are very cautious about wanting to do that. You need to be very careful to consider the context of the site when you take those types of drastic measures. So we had to evaluate all these different treatments, and we had basically a grading rubric for them that put that clover leaf onto a chart and allowed us to grade on what we thought were the most effective, and also most effective, most feasible, and also most best at preserving historic character. So we have them sort of laid out here, plus the ones that we thought were best. This is actually the checklist that we had for the Gables itself, so not for the whole site. We basically did this building by building, looking at what are some of the best measures. But then we kind of got to the question of, when are we going to implement these? Some of them are more urgent than others. What's the priority here? So we used, now this map you already saw, and this one you've already seen sort of iterations of, but these charts have been able to help us sort of time when they are going to be needed. So we created basically these trigger points based off of these charts, primarily using 2030, 2050, and 2070 as our guidelines and kind of filling in the gaps between there. So we have both, groundwater rising and storm surge coming in as the main trigger points of the actions that we need to take. And so we developed a chart like this. This is actually, again, an earlier one where it starts putting in 2030, Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace, groundwater profile above basement elevation in the Hooper Hathaway house. So basically marking when are we going to need to take action on Hooper Hathaway, probably by 2030 at least. And then 2050, we see it rising up, hitting the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, and then 2070 reaching even more. So to sort of, but all of these decision-making processes we were trying to do individually for each building, trying to come up with a process where we would just take the particular area that was going to be a problem and walk it through these steps and these processes. But we kind of came to a realization that there were some issues with that process. To sort of illustrate that, I'm going to go through some of the areas and the way that these things all entangled with each other. So the first, of course, is the area that you've already seen, the water coming in here on the stairwell next to our basement on Hooper Hathaway. So, all right, our trigger point, water entering basement stairwell, which is already happening now. So our solution, gutters, grading, drainage well. We're going to control that stormwater from above. And then shortly thereafter, trigger point, storm surge coming over seawall to Hooper Hathaway basement. And that's roughly about 2030 that we'll be seeing that, if not sooner. So the solution then is dry flood-proof basement, install sump pumps. Then the next trigger point, though, is, and that's pretty much in line with the other one, that the basement is going to start being exposed to groundwater. So this is Hooper Hathaway's low point of its basement. And then, so this shows it happening sometime between 2030 and 2050. We actually just updated this map. This is the one chart that it didn't get updated. But basically, this line is coming further up, so it's going to happen closer to 2030, that the basement is going to be exposed to groundwater regularly. So evacuate the maintenance equipment from the Hooper Hathaway into Prim, and then move mechanical systems upstairs. The only problem is, so we talked about this, can we move everything over to, from Hooper Hathaway over to this? This is another maintenance shed. It's currently situated, right on the water. It's vulnerable itself. So we thought, all right, what if we elevate this building and turn it into our maintenance building? So we looked at what it would need to be a long-term building to put that sort of infrastructure in place. And then we realized that we need to be raised up to 6 feet in order to stay above 2070 100-year flood levels. So then we came up with another idea, because that's really not worthwhile and doesn't really work to our needs, and that's moving the prim house to the parking lot, or some other iteration of that, building something purpose-built. And then what we're going to see is that Hooper Hathaway, though, is going to start getting flooded beyond just an initial storm surge lapping at the front. So we have a flood depth. This is one that we haven't shown too much detail of. So this shows how deep it's going to flood. And this is a 2050 for a 50% chance. So 50% chance by 2050 that every year that storms are going to flood to these depths. And Hooper Hathaway is sitting right about 1.5 feet. So it's going to be getting storms, 50% storms hitting around there. So, we talked about a bunch of different solutions, but one of the things that we ended up coming around to is that Hooper Hathaway is really going to eventually need to be moved itself. But we already talked about moving one building into the parking lot. But what happens if we get in our way with doing that process, moving one building and then having to move another? And we sort of came to the realization that we need to have an overall strategy. This was our first take at looking at moving buildings, and it was a mess. We basically were just sort of like, all right, what happens if, do we even have the room to move everything out of here? But we really needed a vision of where things are going to go. So how are we going to do this process? And that is where Union stepped in, and I'm going to hand things off to Kara now.
Thank you, Paul. I'm Kara Babcock. I'm from Union Studio Architecture and Community Design. We've been involved in this process since the beginning, and it's been incredible, a really fantastic group to work with. So yeah, as Paul left off, during one of our charrettes, our kind of check-in points that you saw a picture of, everybody was kind of sitting around the table, sketch paper, talking. We had these maps, and this was an innovation of one of my colleagues, Alina, to put a magnet board behind the paper so that we could actually literally pick up the buildings and kind of move them around the site as we were talking about the different risks and problems that each of the buildings are encountering over time, either in the near term, the midterm, or the long term. So starting to pick up those buildings and move them, maybe it's in 20 years, maybe 30 years for some other building. Another building might have really significant importance, like the Seven Gables mansion. We want to keep that in place for as long as possible. So super long-term, far out, but eventually, would we have to consider moving that building? So that was kind of the exercise that we went through. And kind of just the framework that we had to kind of take a step back from that process and say, all right, this is kind of something that we are all now have wrapped our heads around, the idea of potentially moving buildings. And what is the kind of the context and the framework for the Gables and the campus around the idea of moving buildings and picking them up and relocating them. And Susan and Paul and the rest of the Seven Gables team were pretty quick to show us the historic documents that is not a unique scenario in Salem or on the Seven Gables site. 3 of the buildings that are on the site currently today were moved there at some point in time, either because they were facing their own risk or problem, or they were under threat of demolition. Susan, is it Susan Emerton or Carolyn Emerton? Took those buildings under her wing and brought them to the site. So we know that there is past historic context on the Seven Gables campus for moving buildings. And some of those buildings have been moved a couple times on the site, which is interesting as well, because there were fires or storms that was a reason for them to move just on the site away from whatever the risk was. So again, just kind of showing you some context for the maps that we were looking at to give us kind of a framework of what is the history of the site, what should we understand about the site and the buildings and the evolution of the campus itself and this block in Salem from a kind of urbanistic study perspective. What is the history and the fabric of this site? And so you can see that there have been many more buildings on this site than there are currently. There was an infill of the block that's typical, where you have buildings, up against the street, along the sidewalks. But some of these buildings have moved around over time. And so most recently in the 1900s, you can see it transitioned between the 1900s and today. Now, a lot of the buildings along Derby Street have gone away. We have the large parking lot as you enter the Seven Gables campus. And the remaining buildings have kind of coalesced around and against the water side. And it's created a beautiful campus. We know that, right? The beautiful gardens. It's a wonderful place to visit. But it's changed over time. And so thinking about that in context as we were moving forward and planning for the next steps. So I kind of went through this as I was showing you those pictures, but just kind of for ourselves, we had to identify what are the changes that the campus has seen over time. And I think Paul or Susan, they said this in a previous presentation that they gave to us, the campus has been surrounded by change for over 350 years. So kind of identifying that for ourselves, but also what are the constants? And they are the location, the beautiful location in downtown Salem, the historic and architectural prominence of the site and the buildings, that will always be true, no matter what happens, and the organization itself, the Settlement Association. The point of the organization historically has been to provide stability in the face of change for Salem's residents and even for newcomers to Salem. And of course, the mission of the Gables will always be a constant. So the big question that we asked ourselves, what will be the next generation of the campus? You see at the top of this slide a historic picture that's basically taken at the same vantage point, what it used to look like, the latest generation of the campus. And so what is the future of the House of Seven Gables? And asking that question, the House of Seven Gables team got together, and I know this took quite a lot of thinking through, but they had to kind of come up with guiding principles for reorganizing the campus. We needed some kind of framework that would work for the museum, for the organization, for Salem, for the history of the site and the buildings, that would kind of guide us through this process, identifying what's important to them, what's important to the community. And I just highlighted a couple of the ones that are pertinent to what you'll be seeing, but for the overall site, the former historic campus area should be used for natural space as well as parking, even if it means reducing the overall amount of parking on site. So they recognize that the large parking lot that is moved further away from the water, it's higher up from an elevation perspective, that there might be some reasons to give up the large amount of parking that they have in order to save the history of the buildings and the site. And then for individual buildings, relocations of other historic buildings should be taken into account, but they shouldn't necessarily be beholden to their past context and orientation. So the images that I showed you of those three buildings that had moved in Salem to this site, they were all kind of orientated and situated differently in the blocks that they were previously living on. Some of them were right up against a sidewalk. They were raised up. They had actually a full level height basement that you could walk into from the sidewalk. They were orientated differently and had different types of elevation in their previous life, and it changed when they came here. Mm-hmm. So the idea that they could change again and could even be raised up in some instances isn't necessarily an odd thing for any particular building. And then from there, we identified kind of what are the main priorities as we're working through this exercise. We had to be, of course, very sensitive to the feasibility and affordability kind of circle that Paul was sharing with you. Anything that we started to pose in the near term, the midterm, the long term, we had to also think about the House of Seven Gables needs to raise money to do any of this work. So moving buildings as few times as possible if they do need to move. So it has to be a thoughtful plan about where they're going. We don't want to be picking one up and then 20 years from now having to move it again, right? Consider the financial constraints, maintain a thoughtful composition and cohesiveness of the campus through its transition. So the transition that you'll be seeing, these phases that we've started to outline, this is over 50 years. And so through that 50 years, the campus itself needs to be cohesive for the House of Seven Gables so that when visitors come on site, they're not going to visit one building at one end of the site and then walking across a dead space to another building just because they're in the middle of that transition over this decades-long process. It needs to look and feel and be cohesive as it transitions. And then, of course, always continue to support and enhance the programming spaces for the Settlement Association. So the idea of what I'll call managed retreat, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that term, retreat of buildings away from the water and into a more resilient zone. That can be a scary concept, and it can feel a little defeatist. So it was really important for us to recognize and understand that there's incredible opportunity that comes with a managed retreat approach. So what are those opportunities for the museum and the staff and the organization? Well, first of all, a more staff and visitor-friendly campus is possible. There are issues and problems with the current campus the way that it is that are dealt with beautifully by the staff and the organization. But of course, the idea of reorganizing the campus feel and the look and the layout, we can work towards a better, more friendly campus. We can reduce programming inefficiencies. We can improve building infrastructure. So we can, as Paul mentioned, making things more energy efficient, sustainable. And we can free up more space in the historic homes for interpretation and exhibits. So one of the images that I showed of one of the homes that it had been moved from its previous site, it had a full height walkout basement, basically. It was a large stone foundation that it was sitting on. The idea that we could move one of these buildings and also raise it up a level, that means that there's more space for interpretation for the museum. They can create space and create some context for the community and for the museum. Right now, a lot of their spaces they've had to kind of use for storage of their collections. Susan talked about some of that space is not ideal from a humidity and long-term standpoint. So the idea that they might be able to gain more space as these buildings move around and are reorganized and it's more thoughtful is an exciting opportunity. That the new campus layout could provide new context to educate people on climate challenges, adaptation, resiliency, mitigation, all the things that Paul's been talking about, they can start to educate the public on. They can potentially get larger outdoor event space and have a more resilient site. And then they can have a more purposeful visitor center with improved amenities and programming. Also, that comes with that, obviously, as we all are hearing and learning about, there's reduced disaster preparation. So the floodgates, the temporary measures, the sandbags, all the things that Paul and his staff need to start doing now and will have to continue to do over the next 5 to 10 years as temporary measures, that will start to reduce and then eventually, hopefully, go away altogether, which could also be helpful from a financial and feasibility standpoint. And then less post-disaster repair and cleanup. And as Susan pointed out, hopefully reduce liability. Always a good thing. So I started to talk about the historic mapping that we looked at, understanding the framework for what used to exist on the campus, but we kind of also had to take a step back and look at the city of Salem and the neighborhood that the House of Seven Gables is in, look at it from an urbanistic standpoint, and kind of what's going on with the campus right now. It's a missing tooth along Derby Street. That parking lot is not adding to the urban fabric and the pedestrian experience for anybody in the community when they're walking by it, right? You can, I mean, honestly, you come here, you see the sign for House of Seven Gables, but you have to go through the parking lot in order to begin to experience the history of the site and the beautiful historic buildings and gardens that they have. So that in itself is a wonderful opportunity to kind of fill in that missing tooth along Derby Street and to start to really enhance the experience for the community, but also make kind of a better entry sequence for the campus itself. So there's our missing tooth, and I'm just going to quickly kind of show you this. Did not happen as quick as it's going to happen right now. This is still part of the 2-year process. But this is kind of where we got to get from point A to point B, thinking about all of the near-term kind of things that we need to be thinking about, the midterm and the long term. But overall, what this is illustrating is that we're really aiming to keep the campus cohesive, thoughtful as it transitions over the decades. So phase 1 is current. Phase 2, you see that the counting house here is moved and has new gardens in front of it. It can be a new interpretation space for the museum, but it still feels connected to the campus. And just for reference, this red dashed line, that's actual fencing around the campus that needs to be maintained. And so thinking about that and that kind of security point. Phase 2, you start to see another building moved, but again, it's creating a nice courtyard effect between these 3 buildings. It's creating some building facade along the sidewalk and along the street, similar to its neighbors. Phase 4, you see a little bit more of the buildings being moved, but you also start to see some work being done along the seawall to make that a more resilient lawn, and to start to introduce maybe some walking paths or something interesting again for the campus that's a little bit different. It can be another form of interpretation, education, talking about resiliency, talking about adaptation. Forget what phase I'm on, but I think this is the second to last. But again, you see more buildings move, but that feeling of campus is still becoming very cohesive. We're introducing another green space, another lawn that's closer up to Derby Street. There's buildings that are surrounding it. So the idea that you can have a nice new kind of bus terminal pull-up to drop visitors off. They can come into potentially a new visitor center, walk through and be introduced into this new lawn space, and have the context of these beautiful historic buildings kind of surrounding them. Maybe this is a new education and learning center for the House of Seven Gables, and the context that did exist where all the buildings were kind of clustered along the water, that started to go away, but it's transforming still into nice green lawn space. It's making the site more resilient, and you'll see a little bit of that later, but this isn't quite showing a lot of the site infrastructure work that's going into place, but that's part of the phasing. And then the final kind of last step, long term, is likely we're going to have to move the House of Seven Gables building, but the idea of leaving its foundation in place as kind of a remembrance of that foundation, its history, and being in the place that it was originally, but ultimately moving the building to be a part of the new context of the campus and kind of that new courtyard and green space is something that we are considering. So you can see we've almost kind of in a way, we've started to flip the campus on its head a little bit. But it's an amazing, actually, we said this throughout the process, how lucky the House of Seven Gables campus is to have the space that they do that's open. I think in many other contexts, you wouldn't have this incredible amount of open space to work with, right? So the idea that they had this, that we could actually move the buildings and make that transition in a really thoughtful and cohesive manner is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And just kind of comparing it again to just picking one of the historic maps, but there's clearly precedent for those buildings to be laid out kind of in a block manner, right? They each had their own properties. They were up against the street and the sidewalk. They were creating that facade along the street and that urban context, and so filling in that empty missing tooth of this neighborhood of Salem, we felt was really exciting and important for the campus to do again. So I'm not going to go into detail through all of this, but this is kind of helping to illustrate, those were kind of the pretty pictures of what that transition is going to do over the course of many decades. But behind the scenes and what we've been working on so diligently, and you'll see in the final report when it comes out, all of the moving parts of the site infrastructure, of the architecture, and the kind of master planning, overall master planning of the site, that is all kind of congealing together, and it's overlaid with the trigger points that we've identified. So when the campus starts to experience certain events, or they start to experience certain events more frequently, that will be a trigger point for them to say, okay, it's now time to put into place this plan of action. We either need to start fundraising for this, we need to start planning for this, we need to start bringing in community partners for this next step. And so this is starting to lay out that plan for them based on those trigger points, and outlining exactly how buildings are going to move, site infrastructure is going to be put into place, and most importantly, anything that's being done is not being undone over time. It's all being thought out long-term, so that when they're putting in that underground storage tank, it's going to stay there and it's going to be useful for decades. So this is just going through the phases. And again, this will all be in the final report that we issue out, so you can really dive in. And then there will be several appendices to the final report of all the work we've done over the 2 years, so you can really understand kind of the data and information that went into making these decisions. But this is really a roadmap or, an action plan for the House of Seven Gables. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Paul to kind of conclude.
That's okay, we don't need that. So thank you, Kara, for sharing that. I'm going to open up things for questions in just a little bit. I'll have everyone kind of come up and we'll try to answer your questions as best as possible. But I kind of wanted to sort of couch this all as that this has been a very iterative process. It's been a lot of back and forth trying to come to these decisions. But the one constant that I think that's really come through is that we're trying to handle this as an individual, but climate change and the adaptations we're going to have to do, that's going to be a communal response. Even we're trying to do our one thing here in this space here, but what we're trying to do is share this information so that way the community can respond, so you can be informed and know what needs to be done. I keep kind of holding out this little hope that, as we're going through this phasing plan, that we might get a city response that allows us to, maybe in phase 3 or 4, say, we've got a community-wide seawall, we might not have to move things fully. Again, the decision makers who are going to be there down the line are probably not all in this room, but what we're trying to also do is make sure that whatever happens, we're not getting in the way of what may ultimately need to happen. So we need to be able to plan for the worst case scenario but work and try to inform so that way the city and everyone can respond together. So that's why we're holding this here. So.